So good evening, everybody. It is 7 o'clock, so now we're going to get started. My name is Mary Newton, and I'm from the Reading League Wisconsin. And tonight we're doing the 4th chapter of Thinking Reading. If you want a certificate of attendance a little bit later in the meeting, I'll be posting a link that you can use to request that. And last week there was some discussion, there's actually been discussion for the past couple of meetings about the idea of what's more important. Should you be looking for reading material that teaches literacy skills, or should you be looking for reading materials for secondary students that are in a content area that they're interested in so that they have motivation to read? And we kind of went through a discussion about that, how those are not mutually exclusive. But Rebecca Miles, who led last week's discussion,
and is here.
And is here, great. So she had mentioned a research article on that topic, literacy skills leading to reading enjoyment rather than going the other direction. So I'm going to post a link to that in the chat also. I think that's all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Rowse-Borrelli. She's also on the board of the Reading League Wisconsin, and she is involved in secondary literacy instruction. So she's much better equipped than I am to lead this discussion. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I met some of you all on that first week, and due to my children being just lovely humans, sometimes getting here at bedtime does not work for me. So I'm so happy to join you all again, especially as we look at this super simple but very informative chapter 4, helping struggling readers in the classroom. So a little bit of background about me. I've been in the classroom for the last 18 years. I started out as an ELA teacher in Norfolk, Nebraska, and then came to Wisconsin in 2013 and have been teaching reading intervention and English language arts for the last 10 years. And, you know, jumped in on the literacy journey through various outputs, both through the world of intervention and then through classrooms. And currently I am the literacy specialist at New Berlin Eisenhower in the state of Wisconsin. So New Berlin, Wisconsin. So a lot of what I've read and kind of how I was going to frame tonight's discussion is just very simple. There were 15 different suggestions around how to help struggling readers in the classroom. And so I listed them here. These were their practical tips. And so they're very, I thought we could expand on those a little bit and see how and what and kind of where our takeaways from this chapter really were. We only have about 2 chapters left with this book. So this idea of, what do secondary readers really need? And then looking next week at what do leaders need, as well as what does reading intervention look like? And so I think that's also another time where you'll see my face again. So in that final chapter, because that's where I live in the world of intervention, but also in the world of content. So I know this is a pretty broad topic, and I know we're not all from Wisconsin. I'm looking at you, Rebecca Miles. But it is fun to think about, how do we really get these, struggling readers in the secondary classrooms? So probably like, I don't know, I'm going to open it up, ask you to unmute. I don't need to do all of the talking because I find like we learn better when we share. So, I think I was talking today with a principal in another school. We were talking about, do your teachers know the students beyond just a reading score, but just what their reading skills are? And we even talked about like, what are 3 simple assessments you could give in the first week of school to have a general understanding? So, maybe we start there. Let's start with number 1. What were any key takeaways on number 1? Know your students' reading skills, not just a general score. Big believer in wait time, so we'll sit here in awkward silence for as long as I need to.
You can drop things in the chat too if you don't. Yes. If you don't want your face and your name to appear on the recording for some reason, you're welcome to put things in the chat. But it's great to have people participate in the discussion.
So if I may, I'm just going to kind of throw this out there. I was a middle school teacher. I'm now at the district office, but I do have a lot of middle school teachers who are not necessarily reading teachers. They're in middle school, they teach their content area, but they do not necessarily teach reading. And so I'm just wondering, how do you all support teachers to help them understand and help them build their capacity on evaluating reading skills in the students that they serve, right? They're not going to go out and get a reading specialist degree, but how can we help them gain that expertise? So I'm really curious to know just what all of your thoughts are on that.
I think that's a great question and even a really great place to start. I don't think these tips are far off from that, as it kind of puts a little triangulation around what good all content area leaders can look at, because they're specialists in their content. They're not necessarily specialists in teaching reading. But I think a suggestion could be taking these first 15, but if you look through this, it starts with vocabulary, reading aloud, and skills. So in some ways, for people, it's identifying what are the necessary skills to read the content in their class. In my school, we talk a lot about like, what's it take to read like a mathematician? What's it take to read like a scientist? And for teachers who live content heavy versus living, the way I might have, like they lack their decoding skills or their phonemic awareness. If they're living content heavy, then they'll understand, like, as an expert of my content, I need to know, and then this is what I can explicitly teach. And I think specifically like a scientist, okay, scientific writing is going to be different than scientific reading and than an English writing or English reading, but scientific reading requires you to look more at different types of things. And so having content specific individuals think like, what do I need to know? And what do I do to understand my content that I can explicitly teach my students? That's kind of my first thought. I also think really going down to that number 13, I'm a big proponent of that systematic language about it, and talking first at the vocabulary level of, like, I think Hattie calls them tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 words. And so, what were those and what's my tier 2 words and how can I address that? Because that will build background knowledge in my content. And then that they aren't reading teachers, but they are teachers of content. So finding the reading elements within the content seems to help jump on that as a practical tip. But that was my take. So I hope there's more out there of people who found successes or have thought processes that you're welcome to unmute or put in the chat.
Can I add to what you just said? Because Beatrice, one of the things that I found early on with the work with my schools was the whole concept of the backwards designing, right? Starting at that end of that rope and then walking backwards regardless of the content. So I would work with particularly around background knowledge and looking at text structures. And even when you're talking about disciplinary literacy, which is what Sarah's referring to, within each literacy that discipline, there's a text structure. But then teaching our content area colleagues how to backwards design, build some slide decks that give access to the background knowledge. I always set a rule of a video should be no more than 2 minutes, right? And actually reading the text and how do we scaffold them through the text. And I'm even for all of our learners on the continuum all the way across, whether they be emerging bilinguals or whether they're or students in special ed, how are we scaffolding that instruction so they can access the text so that they can get to the content? And that might be a bit of a different conversation than this reading piece. I want to trickle back to what you said originally, Sarah. One of the things that we are finding our middle school and high school teachers and collectively the entire schools, they really don't have that battery of tests that are on a continuum, right? That balanced assessment system. They get that general score and then they think they're supposed to be able to do something with a NWEA score, right? And they don't know how to grab diagnostics and then what to do with them. So it's been really informative just giving them some tools, right? They just didn't have the tool. That would be like me trying to nail the trim up in the living room that we're working on right now with my shoe, because it's the only tool I have, right? So I think they appreciate the tools, Beatrice. If we, especially those that are going to be working with our more struggling students, also if everyone in area can backwards design and have a process by what they're backwards designing, then even our intervention teachers can do some preloading, right? And if we have similar routines for how we do vocabulary, similar routines for how we attack a text, similar routines for how we annotate, doesn't matter what discipline we're in.
I do like, Rebecca, the idea of the backward design, working backwards through the rope to figure out what kids need. And I found that a lot of times teachers at the secondary level are not even familiar with the rope. So it gives you a good place to start. These are all the things that go into reading. They could have problems in any one of those. And if they're all, if they all are working well and integrated together, you're going to end up with great reading comprehension. Now start at the other end. If you don't have great reading comprehension, what could the cause be? And start working backward through that rope. I think it gets people thinking more, just in a general way about what's involved in reading and what could possibly go wrong. And then once they have that knowledge, making sure that they do have ways of assessing those different skills. If they find that, I think there's a weakness here, but how do I know for sure? Make sure that there's something that they can do that will pinpoint that. And, while I do think assessment is important, I think Gail also had a good point that she put in the chat. She says, I think we need to talk more about time with text and time reading aloud to practice fluency and less about more assessment. I think assessment is really important, but I also think time spent reading is also important. And if kids get to secondary level, very often they've learned certain skills, but they haven't practiced them enough to have them become automatic and lead to fluent reading. So, perhaps.
I also think, I don't disagree with you. I would add that time with the text has to be purposeful time. It's not,
Right.
Hey, it's silent sustained reading time and you're going to fake read and put your phone in your book and then, see how to waste your 10 minutes. It's what are they reading for? And that's huge. I think that's, there's a couple books out there like No More Fake Reading, and Chris Tovani has talked a little bit about some of that too. And those ideas, especially in secondary, that's like, what are we asking them to do with their reading and why? And I think that comes back to these tips of like, are they fake reading because they don't know vocabulary? Are they, is their time with their text intentional, or the outcome of spending this time? But that's even just in all secondary as instructionally, what are we asking them to do and does it matter? Because if it's just to fill time, they're not going to do it. But if it matters to something that's going to hit it up later, or that they're going to do. And I think that, as we talk about close reading, that's one of the big key components we're working on. And Rebecca just put that in the chat too. It's like, you have to have those close reading structures in place, and what they should be doing. And it comes back to that read aloud too. I wonder if people have found some of the read aloud habits in secondary that might have been in elementary continue, like the skips or the avoidance tactics. And I'm looking kind of moving on to part 2 of those practical tips, have them read aloud to you. But that's another piece of like, what are we doing with this text? And is reading aloud like the popcorn reading that has the, many would say is the worst thing ever? Or I wonder, it's just a wondering more than anything, what does that look like? And how does that kind of connect to take intentional things? Gail's bringing the heat today with this front loading vocabulary in the chat, something Alex quickly talks about a lot. Yes, I think that's building background knowledge. That's building it into print. It's making what they read easier to find. Sometimes even a scavenger hunt for the vocabulary words in their reading as like a pre-reading step, at least gets them to find something they could connect with, a student could connect with.
I think we can see how all these 15 things are interrelated, right? Because
For sure.
we've been skipping around. We've already highlighted a bunch of the 1 through 15, but I think that's good because sometimes we get this idea that I have to do these 15 things and somehow they're all separate, but really they're all integrated. So I think it's good that people are bringing up things that touch on more than one of these practical tips.
It seems to me that all of these are really just connected to like explicit instruction at its core, right? So like those foundational principles Anita Archer talks about, that's exactly what this is. And so I think at a secondary level, we don't always go there first. Like we expect to not have to do that. And so there's some retraining that has to happen there. I started my career as a secondary social studies teacher and then moved into special education. And so I can see how there's an expectation that these skills are there. And when they aren't, people haven't had that training to figure that out. So to me, thinking about starting with those explicit instruction foundations would be a critical place to go. The other thing I was thinking while I think it was Mary was talking about introducing the reading rope. In my role now, I work with a lot of student assistance teams where there's a student who's struggling and people are trying to figure out why. So I'm thinking as a administrator now, I could take that reading rope to the student assistance team, teach them about it, help them understand it. So then when they're problem solving for a student, they have like something to anchor their thinking to. So those are my two thoughts.
And I think that's great because when Hollis Scarborough developed that reading rope, her main purpose was using it as a tool to communicate, communicate with teachers, communicate with parents. These are all the things that need to be going on, and give us some kind of a tool to use that helps us sort things out. The one thing that I would, when I read through these practical tips, I think these kind of work out differently depending on what secondary population you're talking about. If you're talking about the general classroom versus working with a group of kids who are in special education or maybe just identified for some tier 2 intervention, I mean, these things work differently. I'm just like number 2, have them read aloud to you. If you're talking about general classroom and you have kids in there who are poor readers, I mean, that's just incredibly shaming to them to have to read in front of their peers when they cannot read fluently. So if you're if you're using that as a way to figure out which ones are having problems decoding fluently and automatically, I certainly wouldn't do it in a large group setting. Pull those kids aside. And then I'm wondering also, in a general classroom, if you've already done some investigation and you know which kids have the reading fluency issues and which ones don't, it's not going to do you any good to have the kids who don't have any fluency or automaticity problems reading aloud, unless you're trying to get them to model for another student. But I think that reading aloud to you at the secondary level, in my mind, that's something you do with kids who are struggling with that automaticity rather than something that just applies on a general basis every day to everybody in your class. I don't know. What do you think about that, Sarah?
No, I completely agree. I think that there's to that, they're interconnected, and it works for tier 2s, tier 3s. And I also kept thinking, like, this is New Zealand. How different of a school structure or systematic approaches do they have in their education that may not happen? Like, I don't have an opportunity at my school, we don't have one-to-one paraprofessionals to work with struggling readers. It's a pull-out class. At another school, they have one person to go in and support. So the push-in model. So these things are interesting, pieces that kind of come into play. But I think that's the other piece that's not always talked about in secondary research, is the level of shame and the social emotional elements that come with when secondary students struggle in general. And I think I'm a big proponent of executive functions too, but that goes back to I think what Tammy said around, what do kids bring to the table and how do we help them? because those are all pieces that factor into secondary reading. And I'm noticing the chat, and it's, we're missing huge opportunities about training paras about climate and emotional supports, and student services staff to do this with more reading practice and engaging in the text without screens. And I think, I wonder what that could look like. That's it. Thank you, Gail. The Murphys were in England and Ireland, but we're young teachers in New Zealand. So some of what I was pulling was the New Zealand part. Maybe it's just because I live in a bluey world and everyone's in New Zealand right now. So there's a lot of grannies at my house. If you don't know who bluey is, this is probably far removed, but.
I add to this, Sarah.
Please do.
I keep going back to, we had a series with the 4-9 with Kim St. Martin, and meta-analyses from our colleagues, Bowker, Filderman, and Christy. And then we had John Vale and Kate Smith present for us, and they had done some work in the middle school. And here's the thing that, and it was relating to the secondary space, like in general, considering middle school to high school. And what keeps coming to mind is all the way back to structures and systems, right? And I think about what Beatrice was asking earlier. What are some structures or systems of strategies that that the kids could encounter across the building, like the rewards attack for unknown multisyllabic words, like having those routines in place. So maybe they're introduced in the intervention space, but so that we don't have this buckety instruction. What commitments to elongating that service across a student's day and across their disciplines could we implement in some low-hanging fruit sort of ways? John and Kate, I believe it was SQR3 was the strategy for attacking text that they use. Everyone had been trained in rewards, but then there was the intervention that was pull out in addition. So there were the choral reading, some choral exchanging, those type of practices that they laid across the whole building. And I think sometimes we forget that even our most accomplished students can benefit from things that they see benefiting their community. Our high functioning students struggle sometimes for the kids that are struggling too. So I don't know, that's what keeps coming to mind. What structures and systems could we have in place that could just eliminate some things right away by strategies?
I wholeheartedly agree with you, Rebecca, because I think that's a missed opportunity to establish. And then again, that there's something to be said for the sense of familiarity and a comfort when students know what to expect with simply unknown vocabulary or an unknown task. And if every teacher uses the same language and the same thought process and the same approach or similar approaches, then it lessens the fear that may be in a student's world. And it really can help, connect for kids.
I just wanted to mention one thing for those of you who are in Wisconsin. We're waiting for our governor to sign some reading legislation, which we hope will happen. I believe the deadline is next Thursday. We'll see. Anyway, one of the things that's included in there is required professional development. It doesn't have to, it could be letters, it could be an equivalent program, something that's approved basically by IDA as meeting their standards, but only for teachers in kindergarten through third grade, plus reading specialists and building administrators. So who's left out of that? All secondary teachers are left out, and special education teachers are left out. So I think when that legislation was in progress, one of the things we were testifying on was, please at least include special education teachers at all levels, because they're dealing with kids who may be at an elementary level in reading, and they need to know, they need the professional development that the K-3 teachers are getting. But I think if you're, it's not in the legislation, it's limited to that group of teachers. But I think once this hits the districts, if you're in a Wisconsin district, I think you might put a little pressure on your district, like, hey, all that great stuff they're learning down there in K-3, we could really use some of that. You know, is there some way that you can open that up to those of us who are in special ed, those of us who are secondary teachers? Can you have another cohort? You know, we want to learn that too. And I think that maybe they'll be more open to it once they see what it does for the teachers who are in K-3. So I just wanted to put that out there, maybe a way that Wisconsin educators can build on what's in that legislation and make it better.
Agreed. And also that most secondary schools have to have instructional coaches, and oftentimes those are the best people to reach out to, because they can provide you and guide you. And I know I work hard to get professional development for our special ed teachers, but also for our regular ed teachers too. So, and truly, I think that that's we're doing a huge disservice if we're strictly focusing on content or disciplinary literacy. We have to look at the whole student, in order to better support, what their needs are. And it's not a singular thing, just like these aren't one singular tip that's going to change a classroom. It's all a part of that rope. It all weaves together. I think that, Gail, you bring up a really nice thought around we'll just meet them where they are. What does that really mean, though?
How do you know where they are?
How do you know?
How do you know where they are?
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree with meet them where they are, but you have to know specifically where they are, or it's not going to do any good.
Yeah. And I think that I wonder, when we continue reading around that intervention piece, talking around, I know we don't love the idea of assessments, but assessments tell us where they are, and the right assessments can tell us that what they need first in order to build on that next part. And I'm with you, Rebecca, it isn't too late. It's totally the opportunity, but the piece that gets difficult is that I don't think any teacher has it fully established, is like, what's it going to take to get them to believe for themselves that it's not too late? Because that self-motivation and that self-efficacy hasn't really been addressed in these practical tips. Like, student self-efficacy is not a big conversation, especially in secondary.
I just have like a little story to tell. At one of our local high schools, there was a new special education teacher who came in. This was 15 years ago or so. And she wasn't necessarily completely up to date on science of reading, but she had worked for the direct instruction area of SRA and had done corrective reading and reading mastery and so forth. So she was a high school special education teacher, and she screened all of her high school students for their reading levels. And then she decided that she was going to devote an hour a day to classroom instruction. I think they used corrective reading, I'm not positive. And about 2 months later, the principal showed up in her room and said, "What are you doing in here? Because I have these students who are juniors and seniors. They've been in detention almost every day for their entire high school career, and they act out there, you know." And I see them walking down the hall now, and they're like polite. And he said, I pulled one of them over, and he said, "Yeah, I finally got a teacher who believes in me," you know. So she showed him what she was doing, and starting the next semester, all of the special education teachers in that high school were doing that same program with their caseload of kids. Now, who knows, they're probably all gone now and probably not doing it, but you know, it just shows you, I mean, sometimes it's not just the educators and administrators at the secondary level who wonder if really anything can be done, but the kid, there's something big to overcome with kids who have failed so many times and been promised so many times that, oh, this is going to work for you, and then it didn't work. So it does take some convincing until they start seeing the results, and they know when they're learning. So, but I just think is super important to keep in mind that, yeah, everybody needs that belief that you can do this. It's doable.
I don't, I would be curious if anyone has what suggestions, ideas, or wonderings around what Gail put in the chat around the behavior and climate support staff needing training on reading struggles and their relationship. I think Kelly Cartwright put out something similar to that recently around, students, and then that also kind of goes back to Beatrice's question at the beginning, what is that part of the training that teachers need to identify reading struggles, but also to support, because again, not everybody's a reading teacher, but everybody teaches reading in some way, shape, or form.
Or just to be able to look at the kids in your classroom and at least wonder, I wonder if there's a problem here, and because there's always something behind that behavior, and it may not be reading, it may be something totally different, but oftentimes it is reading. It's something that's built up over the years. So there are some trainings out there. I don't know whether they're general to all types of reading struggles, but I know there are some dyslexia trainings out there that are online that people can do that range anywhere from 1 hour to 6 hours, and just kind of generally go over if you're seeing this type of thing, it might be dyslexia. So, that type of generalized training might be good for a PLC, or, just awareness, even if you don't know what to do about it, or it's not your job to be the interventionist, just to be aware of the types of problems that are out there would be good.
Agreed. Is there anybody who had a gut reaction to anything that they read that they felt worthy of discussion for this chapter? We might call it a glow, or an area to grow, or a complete disagreement.
One thing that I wondered on here, just looking at these 15 again, and somebody was talking earlier about the importance of previewing vocabulary, which I think is super, super helpful for so many kids. But then there's also on here number 11, repeated quizzes. So after the fact, if you're quizzing and somebody does particularly poorly, are you just going to give them the low score and let it go? Or are you're going to work with them and maybe, give them some additional instruction and then another attempt at whatever that quiz was? I'm just curious what people's attitudes on that are.
I love that you brought that up, Mary, only because when you look at how it was explained in the book, it felt very like the writing revolution, like an opportunity to use one of Wexler and Hockman's approaches to kind of bring back the content in that repeated quizzes. So I actually didn't do it like, hey, it's a multiple choice quiz and you get it wrong, but it's almost like use the pretest, if you will, and then bring it into like, could you do a and but so? I think if that's a method is and this happened, but that wasn't the case. And so it's been a while, so I can't remember the exact tool, but it was really interesting of like revisiting the content in other areas as that helped deepen their learning and understanding. And I think that number 11 doesn't say it perfectly, but their example was the lake in China. Like, what's the longest river in China? The third longest river in China. What's the third longest river in the world? So it's not the exact question, but it's a similar question. And I think that's something that as just generalized instruction tools that can be revisited, that isn't asking the same question in the same manner, but thinking about encouraging kids to think differently around the same topic. If there's other people who had thoughts around that too, please share.
I think one thing that struck me as I was reading through these are just that student buy-in at the secondary level of when we're going through all these pieces, be it the repeated quizzing or the assessments or the vocabulary building, like we can understand from that, educational standpoint, the importance of those. But one thing I'd be curious to hear other people's thoughts on is just how we frame that in a way that keeps that student engagement and helps them see the why behind it, so that it doesn't just feel like cumbersome work that we're asking them to do. Just really helping them connect that with the bigger picture of where are we going with this, I think struck me. Because again, if there's repeated quizzes or other things without looking at the intentionality, it can be really difficult for a secondary student to buy in.
Well, and I think that they talk, so that's the other thing too about formative assessment versus summative, right? Repeated quizzing as just like almost like a warm up, that it's low stakes, right? Low stakes, high challenge. That I think one piece that they really connected with here on page 78 is that that they're confident that they're going to get reliable corrective feedback and that it will be low key and their status will be undiminished. And that's actually embedded in and really a big piece of corrective reading. You go back, you get corrective feedback, you do it again, you get an opportunity to practice, to mastery, and it's that space practice is going to come back in, and the feedback is not a monologue where someone's just running their mouth on and on and on at you. You're getting corrective feedback, you move back, you get another try at it. It's low stakes. And so I think we've taken the whole standards movement and retesting a little bit too far. I think we test and measure and put it in a grade book way too dang soon, right? And so corrective feedback feels like a failed grade rather than corrective feedback because I'm practicing something, and you're gonna no one's marking this in a book anywhere. So I just think that there's a whole lot of philosophy shifting and mindset shifting that has to happen around grading, growing, and relationships in a secondary space.
And I think rather than looking at, how many, if you have a lot of students that you feel are not passing quizzes or summative tests in your classroom or just barely passing, maybe it's time for us to reevaluate how we're teaching. And how are we teaching vocabulary? I think everybody agrees vocabulary is important, but how are we teaching it? What vocabulary have we chosen? Is it related to a text that we're reading, or is it just arbitrary vocabulary pulled out of nowhere where you're just memorizing it as kind of an isolated group of words? And what are you, is your writing related to what you're reading about, so that you have something to write about? And are you using techniques like last summer we did this book study of the writing revolution, and even their simplest strategies, this because, but, so taking that strategy with whatever you're reading and then saying, okay, now complete this sentence. Alexander Hamilton was from Barbados, but, I don't know where he's from, I can't remember, but, or so, or because, you can find out from doing little writing exercises like that whether the kids are getting what's going on, rather than focusing on an arbitrary list of vocabulary words that are unrelated to the text you're reading, and writing assignments that are unrelated to the text that you're reading, or comprehension exercises that are just working on comprehension strategies in an isolated format. So, what's the main idea? Can you visualize this? Rather than integrating everything with what you're trying to learn about. So, I think sometimes just a little reevaluation of the way we're teaching comprehension, vocabulary, and writing, all those things work together to make kids better writers, so better readers, better comprehenders. Anissa has her hand raised.
Sorry, that's my mistake.
Anissa, do you want to unmute and say your piece, please? I always miss the raised hands.
I think she said it was a mistake. I hope not.
Oh,
I would
okay.
love to hear more.
Okay. Maybe she's just testing out.
That's okay.
Yeah, I don't know how to use raised hands, so I'm clueless.
There we go. I really, I think, you know, as they end the chapter and they share these 15 tips, and curious if there's other, you know, that idea around relationships. I don't know, grading, growing in relationships. I think that was Rebecca. That's how you kind of labeled that. I like that as almost like an ending conversation to go with this, especially around like, what does everybody need and how does that move forward? Because really these tips are very functional and they do work well in secondary, but they look different no matter who and what and how. So if there's anybody else who has anything else to share, I don't feel like we need to go a whole hour. So unless people have other things they want to discuss.
I'm just putting some stuff in the chat, some little reminders for everybody.
Can I ask you guys a question? Those of you that are, oh, you guys, I said, can I ask a question? For those of you that are educators in the secondary space, talk to me about administration. And those of you that are administrators, what does this look like, feel like? And how does the lack of administrative understanding really impact this work, do you think, as well? This on both from the lens of the educator, the parent, and the teachers. Oh, that's next week.
That is next
Yes,
week.
I shouldn't. Did you put that up just as I was saying that? Because now I feel like kind of like an idiot. But yeah,
I put it up just to kind of share that this was
Okay.
happening. But I think to
Right.
that point, it does get everybody's thoughts. It's a way to start
Yeah.
the process. So the president of the Wisconsin Reading League, Jeannie, it was going to be leading next week about what school leaders need to know and do about reading. But it is a great point of question. Like, do school leaders know about reading? Because many school leaders weren't English teachers or even literacy specialists either. And so I can speak in our district, we've worked harder to get professional learning for our administrators through other outside resources. But I think it's also becoming, for our school, they put it back on the literacy specialists to use their knowledge to help put it and then support it directly. But I think Janice was going to pop up and share something, so I'd love to hear that.
Sure. What I was going to say is that I think, especially at the secondary level, everybody is fighting for their own resources. And for us as reading people to expect like the math department or the science department to be jumping behind our reading initiatives or our reading. Do you know what I mean? Everybody is just so scarce with what they have that they have to focus on their own area. So I think that is something that it's going to affect, especially at the secondary level. Who's ever got the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
Unless it's the literacy specialist, and then she makes the wheel squeak for everyone.
Yes, we hope so, but not everybody understands that because they're very narrow focused. So
I understand. I get that too.
Yeah, I do like Gail's comment. Something very different here from the UK is how much technology we have and how often the kids are just on their phones. And, I mean, it doesn't apply to just reading, obviously it applies to everything, but I just see that. I do agree with Gail. I see that becoming, an ongoing issue interfering with the ability to learn.
I just wanted to add that when I'm speaking with other administrators, a thing that I continue to hear over and over again, and started before COVID, but it's only, amplified since, is, well, we have to deal with these social emotional needs, and we're not going to be able to get to anything else until we get that under control. Like, those are the phrases that people use, and it's just very disheartening, because I don't feel like people are thinking like, oh, I wonder if some of those social emotional needs are connected to the fact that I can't engage with the work or whatever. So that's a real barrier that I see from administration, is just feeling like those other things that are, the behaviors that are taking up all of their workday, the mental health crisis that kids are having, like they're putting energy into that and not getting back to like root cause stuff. So maybe next week we'll get some ideas about that, but
Maybe I could rope Steve Dykstra into joining us for a few minutes next week. He's on our board. He's kind of known around the country. He's a clinical psychologist and deals with kids with all kinds of trauma. And as he became interested in the past 20 years in reading issues, one of the things he always talks to his clients about is, are you, depending on their age, are you having problems learning to read, or did you have problems learning to read? And how do you feel about reading? And very often he's found that kids who are perfectly willing to talk about horrible traumatic incidents that you'd think they just couldn't bring up, they'll talk about that dispassionately, but when they talk about their struggles learning to read, they'll start to cry. They're so upset about it. It's been with them so long. It's so deep. It underlies so many things. So maybe it's time for a little Steve Dykstra redux, right? We need him to come on and talk about how social emotional issues and reading run both ways.
And he was able to share with us at the beginning with this, because he led our chapter 1. And so I think some of that insight has been very helpful.
If you want to go back, and on our YouTube channel, we have all the recordings of all these sessions. So if you want to go back and watch the chapter 1 discussion that Steve led, I'm sure he makes some comments on this issue. He always does, and it's always interesting. So yeah, feel free to invite Steve to talk to an administrator group. He loves to do that kind of thing. He will, he doesn't go where he's not wanted, but if people invite him in, he'll come in. And one of the great things about Steve is he's not afraid to say things that sometimes many other people are thinking, but because of their position or whatever, they just can't say it out loud. He doesn't care. He'll just say it like it is. So yeah, please, feel free to reach out to him. You can always reach him by emailing us through Reading League Wisconsin, and we can pass the message on to Steve. He talks to all kinds of groups. He talks to policemen. He talks to just all kinds of social workers and whatever. So he's a great resource to have. Yeah, and then, yes, that episode 100 of Melissa and Lori Love Literacy, he's had that, they interviewed Steve, and there have been a lot of comments about that episode. So he said, like he says, he will leave people laughing and crying because he just knows this topic so deeply.
He has a passion for it, which I think is something that we can all say by people here on this chat. It's learning, it's improving, it's creating an opportunity for students and individuals to find success in the world and beyond. So I might Pollyanna this a little bit, but I'm going to take it, and I'm going to work hard figuring out how to do that as best as possible. So finally, I think just if you haven't done the chat or you wanted that certificate, that's great. Please jump on there. It is here. If there's a link, I don't know if it's clickable. It should say, but just in case.
Yeah,
so
we have a link to that.
Yep. And then we'll see you all next week for looking at it from the what do school leaders need to know about reading.
Right.
And this truly is the piece where get your voice out there and tell your leaders what they need.
I just also want to mention that we have a lot of other programming coming up, and starting right away at the beginning of August, we have our first free virtual meeting. Is it August 1st, Sarah?
Yes.
Sarah's going to participate in that along with Amy McGovern and Jeannie Shop from our board. And it's basically like if you're in one of the many schools that's starting to make the shift from balanced literacy to more of a structured literacy approach and trying to get into what does science really tell us about how reading works. It might be helpful to tune into that because Sarah and Amy and Jeannie have all been through that shift in their own districts. They've helped other districts make that shift. So I think, it'll give you a chance to connect with people who are both in the same position you're in, or people who are a couple of years further down the road and might ease your mind about the whole process. So that's coming up. And then I put a link to our website in the chat, and on the events part of our website, we have all of our events coming up for the next year listed. So basically we do a monthly Tuesday evening topic on one thing or another. October 27th is our annual conference in Brookfield, Wisconsin, and we also have a live stream option for that. So we hope people will join. Our opening morning speaker is Emily Hanford, so I'm sure she'll get things off to a rousing start. And we have our Teachers Lounge meetings with Jeannie, and Rebecca very often is a participant in Teachers Lounge, and those are occasional Saturdays through the year where you can log in and bring your questions and have the discussion move around what interests you. So lots of things planned for this year. So if you just go to our website, it's all laid out for you there. I so much appreciate everybody joining tonight, and special thanks to Sarah and Rebecca for leading this conversation and using all their experience and expertise to guide the conversation. That's really helpful. And thank you to all of you for joining in. And it's just, I love hearing from people in the field and what their concerns are and what their thoughts are. It's always very enlightening. So I think if that's it, I heard somewhere that people never mind if meetings are adjourned early. So I think we're going to do that. And we hope we see you here next week. Jeannie Shop will be here 2 o'clock next Tuesday, or 2 o'clock, 7 o'clock.
2 o'clock, no, 7.
7 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock somewhere, but 7 o'clock Central Time next Tuesday to discuss chapter 5. So we hope you see you then. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.